Before oil-powered machines, before sugar-fueled empires, and before coffee filled the rooms where merchants, thinkers, and revolutionaries changed the world, there was a white crystal, so ordinary today that most people barely notice it: salt. It sits quietly on kitchen tables, disappears inside processed food, and gets scattered across icy roads every winter. But for most of human history, salt was not cheap, common, or invisible. It was survival. Without it, fish spoiled, meat rotted, cities struggled to store food, and armies could not march for long. A kingdom that controlled salt did not just control flavor. It controlled preservation, trade, taxation, and hunger itself. That was the strange power of salt. It was small enough to fit in your hand, but important enough to feed civilizations, fund governments, spark rebellions, and help build empires. To understand why salt mattered so much, you have to imagine a world before refrigerators, before canned food, before artificial preservatives, and before fresh meat could be shipped across oceans in frozen containers. In that world, food was always fighting a losing battle against time. A fish pulled from the sea began to decay almost immediately. A slaughtered animal might feed a family or a village for a few days, but without a way to preserve it, much of that food could be lost before anyone had the chance to eat it. Hunger was not always caused by an empty field or a failed harvest. Sometimes, hunger came from something even crueler: having food in front of you, but not being able to keep it long enough to survive the winter, cross a desert, sail an ocean, or feed an army far from home. Salt changed that. When people rubbed it into meat, packed it around fish, mixed it into cheese, or used it to pickle vegetables, they were doing something far more important than improving flavor. They were slowing decay. Salt pulled moisture out of food and made it harder for bacteria to survive, turning something fragile into something that could last for weeks, months, or even through an entire winter. Suddenly, a farmer could preserve pork after slaughter season. A fishing village could store its catch instead of losing it to rot. A sailor could carry food across dangerous waters. A soldier could march far beyond the nearest farm. And a city could grow larger because it no longer had to consume everything the moment it arrived. Salt did not simply make food taste better. It stretched time. And in a world ruled by hunger, that was power. Long before empires carved their names into stone, salt was already shaping the movements of life. Animals searched for it naturally, licking mineral deposits from rocks, riverbanks, caves, and dry earth. Humans watched them, followed them, and learned from them. Over time, those animal paths became human trails. The trails became trade routes, and the trade routes slowly became the bones of future settlements. Wherever salt appeared, people gathered. Along coastlines, they trapped seawater in shallow ponds and waited for the sun to leave behind white crystals. Near brine springs, they boiled salty water until only the mineral remained. In mountains and underground deposits, they broke rock salt from the earth itself. At first, salt seemed like a gift from nature, but nature did not give it equally. Some places had more than they could ever use. Others had almost none, and that imbalance changed everything. Once salt was unevenly spread across the world, it stopped being just a natural resource and became a reason for trade. A farming village might have grain, animals, and fresh water, but without salt, it struggled to preserve meat, protect food stores, and keep livestock healthy. A desert community might have salt in abundance, but need crops, cloth, tools, and animals from somewhere else. So people began to move. They carried salt across mountains, deserts, rivers, and coastlines, exchanging it for whatever their own land could not provide. This was the beginning of salt's transformation, from mineral to currency, from seasoning to strategy. The people who controlled salt deposits controlled more than a product. They controlled a need. And once rulers understood that every household, every army, and every marketplace depended on it, salt became something far more dangerous than food. It became political power. In the ancient world, salt routes connected people long before modern nations existed. One of the most famous was Rome's Via Salaria, the Salt Road, a route linked to the movement of salt from coastal areas toward the interior of Italy. To Rome, roads were never just roads. They were arteries of power. They carried soldiers, messages, taxes, grain, weapons, and supplies. And among those supplies, salt mattered, because it helped keep food edible long after it should have spoiled. A marching army did not survive on courage alone. It survived on logistics, preserved meat, salted fish, stored rations, and reliable supply lines could decide whether soldiers kept moving or collapsed far from home. Rome understood this with brutal clarity. An empire was not built only by swords, walls, or laws. It was built by the ability to feed people across distance, and salt made distance survivable. There is a famous story that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, and that this is where the word salary comes from. The truth is more complicated, and historians often treat that version as exaggerated. But the legend survives because it points to something real. In the Roman world, salt was valuable enough to be linked with labor, movement, supply, and state control. It was not just something people sprinkled on food. It was part of the invisible system that kept cities alive and armies moving. Every road, every fort, every military camp depended on food that could last beyond the next day. Salt helped make that possible. It turned fresh meat into rations. It made distant campaigns more realistic. It gave Rome one more tool for controlling space, bodies, and time. The sword may have conquered territory, but salt helped hold it. But Rome was only one chapter in salts.
Move these carts
much larger story.
The prices are high.
Across the world, other civilizations discovered the same secret.
The frontier was harsh.
Whoever controlled salt could control money.
Salt,
in China, salt became one of the great instruments of state finance. For long periods, governments controlled or taxed salt because it reached everyone. People could avoid luxury goods. They could live without silk, fine porcelain, or rare spices, but they could not live without salt. That made it perfect for rulers. Every household needed it. Every market moved it. Every family bought it again and again. A salt monopoly could fund officials, build infrastructure, support armies, and help hold together a vast state. It was not glamorous like gold, but it was far more dependable. Gold sat in palaces and treasuries. Salt moved through kitchens, markets, farms, and roads. Quietly, it turned necessity into revenue. But when something essential becomes a source of government money, a darker pattern begins to appear. Salt was not like a jewel, a luxury fabric, or an imported spice that only the wealthy could afford. It touched everyone. The poor needed it as much as the rich. Farmers needed it for animals and food preservation. Fishermen needed it for their catch. Families needed it for cooking, storage, and survival. That made salt incredibly useful to rulers, but dangerous for ordinary people. Because a tax on salt was really a tax on necessity. It followed people into their homes, their markets, their kitchens, and their winter food stores. Every pinch could carry the weight of authority. And once governments learned how much money could be extracted from something people could not avoid, salt stopped being only a lifeline. It became a burden. Across the world, salt carried this double meaning. It could save lives, but it could also make people dependent on those who controlled it. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in the great salt routes of West Africa.
Heave!
From the
Make sure
Sahara,
the ropes are tight.
blocks of salt moved south
Almost
by camel
there.
caravan,
Careful
crossing one of the harshest landscapes on Earth.
Agreed.
Imagine
A fair
long
exchange for the
lines of
grain and the
animals
cloth.
moving through
May your
heat,
harvests
dust,
be
and
plentiful
silence,
until the next
carrying
caravan.
heavy slabs of white mineral across a desert where one mistake could mean death. For communities living in places where natural salt was scarce,
This price is too
this
high for
mineral
the
was
quality.
not a
It
small
is the
luxury.
finest glaze in the
It was
city.
as
I will not
important
lower
as
the
grain,
price.
metal,
Salt. Fresh
cloth,
salt
or
from the
animals.
mine.
It is
The
the
salt
finest
trade
from the
helped
north.
connect North
We need more
Africa
cloth.
with
I will give
powerful
you 3
West
measures of
African
grain
cities,
and the cloth.
turning desert routes into commercial lifelines. Salt did not just cross the Sahara, it tied entire worlds together. Those desert routes helped turn places like Timbuktu into part of a vast commercial world. Salt moved south. Gold, ivory, cloth, books, and knowledge moved through the same networks.
I found the
Traders,
passage on
scholars,
astronomy you requested.
rulers, and travelers
Excellent.
all
We
became
must review
connected
it
by
before the
routes that
lecture.
looked impossible from the outside. To cross the Sahara was to gamble with thirst, heat, sandstorms, and distance. But salt made the risk worth taking.
We
In
must
some
agree on the
regions,
exchange rate for the
it
gold
was
dust
valuable
today.
enough to
The
be
caravan leaves
exchanged
by
for
sunset.
precious
I
goods
understand the urgency,
because people
but
did
the
not
price for the
simply
salt
want
has
it.
increased.
They needed it. A
Few
block of
cities
salt
rivaled
carried
the wealth
across
of
the
Timbuktu.
desert was more
Here,
than
the great
merchandise.
caravans met in
It
the
was
unforgiving
survival,
desert.
carved
Salt
into stone.
was more than currency.
And this is where the
It was
scale of the
survival
story
itself,
begins to grow.
etched into the stone.
Salt
scales
helped
are
feed
balanced.
families.
A fair trade
Then
for the gold.
it supplied
I will
cities.
take 5 lengths
Then
of that
it
silk.
connected continents.
Make way, the salt
And
caravan
eventually,
is moving out.
it
Come,
helped
let
create
us see the
fortunes
quality
large
of the
enough
salt.
to attract kings.
A fair price.
By
In
the
medieval
11th
Europe,
century,
salt-rich
was the
places
bedrock of
became
Europe's
more than
economy,
useful.
and towns
They became
like this one
strategic.
near the brine springs
A town
became
with
vital
access to a
strategic
salt mine,
centers.
a brine spring, or a coastal salt flat could grow wealthy while other towns depended on it. Merchants who controlled salt routes could build fortunes. Ports that handled salted fish could feed markets far beyond their own shores. Salted cod, herring, pork, cheese, and preserved vegetables helped people survive long winters, religious fasting periods, and the dangerous uncertainty of harvests.
Pay the full amount now.
In a world where fresh
barely have
food
enough to
spoiled
last the
quickly
winter, sir.
and famine
master
always
sends
waited
his
nearby,
regards. Watch your
preserved
feet there,
food
move it
gave
along.
communities a
Heave
kind
now,
of protection
steady as she
against
goes.
time. Salt made it possible for sailors to travel farther,
These
armies
stone
to
arteries
remain
were the true
supplied
source of
longer,
Roman power,
and cities to think
facilitating
beyond the
rapid
next
movement of
meal.
both legion-
It allowed human
Watch the
life to
ropes
stretch
there.
across
Careful with that
seasons,
barrel, man. We
oceans,
need it to last
and
the journey.
borders.
Move it up.
But the more important salt became, the more dangerous it became for ordinary people. Because rulers noticed something very simple. Salt was the perfect tax. It was not like wine, jewelry, silk, or imported luxuries.
The
Those
measure
could
is
be
final.
avoided.
Pay the
Salt
levy,
could not.
as you
A tax
command.
on salt reached everyone. The
In the
farmer, the
unforgiving
merchant,
desert,
the sailor,
salt
the widow,
was more
the
than
soldier,
currency.
the poor family trying to
It was
preserve meat for
survival
winter,
itself,
and the wealthy household
etched
filling its
into the
storerooms.
stone.
It followed people into their kitchens, their barns, their markets, and their daily meals. Every bag, barrel, or handful of salt could become a reminder that survival itself had a price. And that is what made salt taxation so hated. It did not feel like a tax on comfort. It felt like a tax on life. Once governments discovered that, salt became one of the most resented sources of power in
Vérifiez les
history.
registres.
In
Il
France,
manque 20 sacs de
this
sel.
hatred had a
Impossible,
name,
monsieur.
the gabelle.
Tout est consigné ici.
It was the salt tax, and over time,
Suivant.
it became one of the most
Payez le dû.
infamous
Oui,
symbols
monsieur
of
l'officier.
inequality
Voici.
under the old
Dépêchez-vous,
regime.
on n'a pas toute la
The
journée.
problem was not only that people had to pay for salt,
Halt!
it was that the
Show me your
system could
papers
feel
immediately.
unfair,
But I already showed
intrusive,
them at the last checkpoint.
and
Do not
impossible
argue
to
with me.
escape.
We must.
In some regions, salt cost far more than in others. In some places, families were required to buy a fixed amount, whether they wanted it or not. Smuggling became common because ordinary people tried to avoid a tax they saw as cruel and unreasonable. But smuggling brought punishment, surveillance, and fear. Something that should have belonged in the kitchen became a source of resentment between the people and the state. A pinch of salt had become political. The French Revolution was not caused by salt alone. No serious history should reduce something that massive to one tax. France was already under pressure from debt, hunger, inequality, political failure, and a social order that protected privilege, while ordinary people carried the burden. But the gabelle became one of the clearest symbols of what was wrong. It showed that the old system could reach into the most basic parts of daily life and turn necessity into punishment. For a poor family, salt was not an abstract political issue. It was the thing used to preserve food, season meals, and survive hard seasons. When even that became controlled, unequal, and expensive, resentment hardened. Salt became proof that power was not just above people in palaces and courts. It was inside their kitchens. And once a basic need becomes a symbol of injustice, it can help turn anger into rebellion. More than a century later, another empire would learn the same lesson in a very different place. In British-ruled India, salt was again placed under colonial control and taxation. The logic was brutally simple. Everyone needed it, rich or poor, Hindu or Muslim, farmer or laborer. Every person used salt. That made it one of the few issues that could reach across language, class, region, and religion. The British did not have to convince people to buy salt. Nature had already made it necessary. But by controlling production and taxing it, the empire turned an everyday mineral into a daily symbol of foreign rule. Every meal carried a reminder of power. Every poor family that struggled to afford salt could feel the empire not as an abstract government, but as a hand pressing down on the most basic needs of life. And that made salt dangerous again. Mahatma Gandhi understood that danger better than almost anyone. In 1930, when he wanted to challenge British rule, he did not choose a palace, a battlefield, or a luxury reserved for the rich. He chose salt. The choice was brilliant because it was painfully simple. Salt belonged to everyone. It came from the sea, the sun, and the earth. Yet an empire claimed the right to control it. Gandhi and his followers began walking toward the coast, mile after mile, through villages, dust, heat, and crowds of watching people. The image was almost impossible to ignore. An old man in white cloth, walking not to seize a throne, but to pick up a handful of salt. And in that moment, a tiny crystal became something much larger. It became a challenge to the empire itself. When Gandhi reached the coast at Dandi, the act itself was almost shockingly small. He bent down and lifted salt from the shore. No army was defeated, no government building fell, no weapon was raised. But that was exactly why the moment became so powerful. It revealed the absurdity of an empire, claiming ownership over something created by seawater and sunlight. Soon, people across India began breaking the salt laws in their own way. They made salt, sold salt, marched, protested, and accepted arrest. The British government could punish individuals, but it could not erase the symbol. Salt had become a language everyone understood. It spoke to the poor, the workers, the farmers, the mothers cooking for their children, and the millions who felt colonial power in ordinary life. A mineral once used to preserve food was now preserving a nation's demand for freedom. That is the hidden genius of salt in history. For centuries, it could sit quietly in bowls, barrels, mines, markets, kitchens, ships, and storehouses, looking too ordinary to matter.
Salt.
But at the right moment,
A language
salt revealed the entire
everyone
structure of
understands.
power around it. Who controlled food? Who controlled trade? Who controlled taxes? Who decided what ordinary people were allowed to take from the earth? These were not small questions. They were the questions behind empires. Salt made them visible because salt touched everything. It touched the body, the table, the marketplace, the army, the law, and the border between survival and obedience. That is why rulers wanted it. That is why merchants risked deserts for it. And that is why ordinary people, again and again, were willing to resist when someone tried to control it too tightly. Then the modern world began to weaken salt's ancient throne. Refrigeration changed everything. Canning changed everything.
50 psi.
Chemical preservatives,
All right, noted.
industrial food
Looks good
systems,
for the next shift.
railroads, steamships, and eventually frozen shipping changed everything again. For thousands of years, salt had been one of humanity's strongest defenses against decay. But suddenly, meat could be frozen. Fish could be packed in ice and transported over long distances. Vegetables could be sealed in cans. Food could cross oceans without being buried in barrels of salt. The old fear of rot did not disappear, but it no longer ruled daily life in the same way.
Lower it down, easy now.
Salt was still useful,
Watch the stack on the
still
left.
necessary,
Make fast when it lands.
still everywhere. But it was no longer the only wall between people and hunger. One of the oldest powers in civilization had been challenged, not by an army or a rebellion,
See that spike at
but by
0400
technology.
hours? Yes, but it...
But salt did not
Salt
disappear.
is no longer the
It simply
only wall
changed
against
costumes.
hunger.
The same mineral that once sat at the center of food preservation moved
moisture
deeper
content
into the
seems high on
machinery
this
of the
batch.
modern world.
Yeah, adjust the
Today,
dryer temperature
most
slightly.
people notice salt only when they taste it, but its real presence is much larger than the kitchen. It is used in food processing, agriculture, water treatment, road de-icing, chemical production, textiles, manufacturing, and countless industrial systems most consumers never
Check the
see.
hydraulics on the plow.
Cities still depend
Make
on
sure
it
the chains
when
are
winter
secure
roads
before
freeze.
you head out.
Factories still use it to create basic chemicals. Food companies still use it to preserve, flavor, and shape the products stacked on supermarket shelves. Salt lost some of its ancient glamour, but not its importance. It no longer needed caravans, royal monopolies,
Keep
or
moving.
guarded trade
The
routes
day
to
is
shape
getting
civilization.
warmer. I know.
It became
These
quieter,
sacks feel heavier
cheaper,
every mile.
and more hidden. But it remained everywhere. And this is where the story takes its strangest turn. For most of history, people feared not having enough salt. Today,
Finest
in
salt
many
in the
parts of the
territory,
world,
madam.
the
I'll
problem
give you
is
3
having
coins
too
for that
much.
basket.
The same mineral that once
We need
protected
more
humans
haulers by
from
the spring.
starvation now hides inside processed food, fast food, snacks, sauces, canned meals, and restaurant dishes. It is no longer rare enough to inspire caravans, or powerful enough to make kings guard mines, but it still shapes human life in a quieter way. Modern people may not fight wars over salt taxes, but their bodies still respond to it. Their diets still depend on it. Their food systems still use
How
it.
can they raise the salt tax
moved
again?
from the center of
Our
empire
families will starve
into the
this winter.
background
We
of
must
everyday
refuse to
consumption.
pay.
It became cheap, invisible, and dangerously easy to forget. But ordinary does not mean powerless. The irony is hard to miss. Salt once helped humanity survive scarcity, and now it belongs to a world struggling with excess. It preserved meat before refrigeration, carried fish across oceans before modern shipping, supported armies before industrial logistics, and helped governments raise money before modern tax systems. It crossed deserts on the backs of camels, filled barrels in medieval ports, moved through Roman roads, financed states, angered peasants, and gave revolutionaries a symbol powerful enough to challenge empire. Few substances have traveled so quietly through so many parts of human history, and yet today, most people see it as nothing more than a cheap ingredient.
The salt
That
is
may be
weighed.
salt's greatest
Now,
trick.
the grain and the bronze
It becomes
tools.
most
A fair
powerful
exchange.
when
May
people
your
stop
journey be
noticing it.
prosperous.
Because by the time something reaches every table, every factory, every road, and every body, it no longer looks like power. It looks normal. But normal things are often the ones that reveal the most about civilization. Salt shows how human history is not shaped only by kings, battles, inventions, or famous names. Sometimes, it is shaped by the basic problem of keeping food from rotting. A mineral pulled from seawater, springs, mines, and dry earth helped decide where roads were built, where towns grew, what governments taxed, how armies moved, and why ordinary people sometimes rebelled. It turned geography into wealth. It turned hunger into strategy. It turned preservation into power. And that is what makes Salt's story so unusual. It never needed to be rare, like diamonds, or beautiful like gold. Its value came from something deeper. People needed it every day. They needed it before they understood chemistry, before they understood bacteria, before they understood why food spoiled. Salt worked first. Explanation came later. Salt also reminds us that power does not always announce itself with crowns, flags, or armies. Sometimes, power looks like a trade route. Sometimes, it looks like a tax office. Sometimes, it looks like a barrel of preserved fish sitting in a ship's hold, allowing sailors to stay at sea longer than their enemies. For thousands of years,
the humid air meant the catch would soon
societies
turn.
that handled
But the salt,
well,
vital for
could
preservation,
store food,
remained tightly controlled
move
and
supplies,
priced out of reach.
support workers, feed soldiers, and survive seasons that might have destroyed weaker systems. The societies that
The
lacked
moisture
it
content seems
had to
high on
trade
this
for
batch.
it,
Yeah,
fight
adjust
for it,
the dryer
or
temperature
submit to
slightly.
those who controlled it. That is why salt appears again
along
and
now,
again
faster.
at turning
Next in
points
line.
in history.
Present your papers.
It was never just about taste. It was about endurance.
The price
And
of
endurance,
salt is
over
unbearable.
time, becomes
How
civilization.
are we supposed to live?
That is also
The
why
British
salt's
take
history
everything.
feels so different from the history of gold. Gold inspired obsession because it was beautiful, rare, and symbolic. Salt inspired control because it was necessary. Gold could sit untouched in a vault and still impress a king. Salt had to move. It had to be mined, boiled, dried, packed, transported, taxed, guarded, sold, and consumed. Its power came from circulation. Every journey it made connected landscapes to markets, markets to governments, and governments to ordinary bodies. A salt mine could make a town wealthy. A salt road could make a region important. A salt tax could make a ruler rich. And a salt law could make a population furious. That is the strange
How can
lesson
they raise
hidden
the salt
inside
tax
this
again?
white crystal.
Our families will
The
starve
things
this
people
winter.
need
We must
most are
refuse
often
to
the
pay.
easiest for power to capture. In the modern world, salt no longer looks like an empire builder because its power has been absorbed into systems too large to notice. It moves through factories, highways, supermarkets, hospitals, chemical plants, and water systems. It helps soften water, produce industrial chemicals, cure food, protect roads from ice, and stabilize countless processes behind modern life. The old caravans are gone. The guarded salt roads have faded.
50
The royal
caddies of salt.
monopolies and colonial laws belong to
Pay
history,
the remaining tax in
but the
coin.
mineral itself never left.
Check the
It simply
seals on
became
the lower
part of the
tier.
infrastructure.
Make sure
And
the
that
salt
may be
hasn't
why
breached
people
the wood.
underestimate it. We tend to notice power only when it is dramatic. A war, a king, a revolution, a machine. Salt is quieter than that. It works in the background. It does not demand attention. It just keeps appearing. Wherever human life needs preservation,
Please,
production,
we need the salt.
movement,
We offer all our
and
grain.
control. So the
This
story
much
of
for so
salt
little.
is not
It is
really
fair
the story
price.
of a seasoning. It is the story of how something small can become central when every human life depends on it. It begins with hunger and preservation. Then it becomes trade. Then trade becomes wealth. Wealth becomes taxation. Taxation becomes resentment. And resentment, under the right pressure, becomes rebellion. Salt passed through all of these stages without ever changing what it was. A simple mineral, a white crystal. But around it, humans built roads, markets, laws, monopolies, punishments, and movements for freedom. That is what makes salt so powerful as a historical force. It did not need to command armies directly. It only had to sit at the center of survival. Once it did, everyone came to it. farmers, merchants, kings, soldiers, smugglers, and revolutionaries. And now, after thousands of years of shaping human survival, salt has almost vanished from our imagination. Not because it became unimportant, but because it became too available. The things that once made people desperate, powerful, or afraid often become invisible when modern life makes them easy.
I'll give you 3 coins
We
for that
open a
basket.
cabinet and find salt
We need
waiting
more
there.
haulers by the
We
spring.
eat food preserved, processed, seasoned, or stabilized by it, without thinking about the ancient systems behind that taste. We drive on roads made safer by it in winter. We live in cities supported by industries that still depend on
the
it.
bulk of the shipments
But
along
beneath
this river,
that ordinary
we avoid
surface
the mountain tribes.
is a much
But what of
older
the Western
story
Karak?
of hunger,
They rely on the
caravans,
old road. The army
taxes,
marched on
smugglers,
salted rations,
soldiers,
a grueling
ships,
journey where
revolutions,
every pound of
and
preserved
empires.
food was worth its
Salt
weight in gold.
did not disappear from history. It became part of the foundation. And foundations are easy to forget because everything else is built on
By
top
order
of
of the
them.
Crown, all
The
salt
story of
reserves are
salt
hereby
is the
marked
story of
and subject
civilization
to the
in
new
miniature.
levy.
It begins with the body, because humans needed it to live. Then it moves to food, because people needed it to survive seasons of hunger. Then it becomes trade, because some lands had it and others did not. Then it becomes wealth, because whoever controlled salt controlled a need. Then it becomes taxation, because rulers saw that no household could escape
Check the
it.
hydraulics on the
Then
plow.
it becomes rebellion,
Make sure the chains
because
are secure
people will
before you
only
head out.
tolerate power over survival for so long. And finally, it becomes ordinary, sitting quietly on the table as if it had never shaped the world at all. But the next time
Salt
you
is
see
no
salt,
longer the only
remember
wall
this.
against hunger.
Before it was cheap, it was precious. Before it was invisible, it was worth fighting over. And before it was ordinary, it helped build empires.